Welcome to the Psych Gym. I'm your trainer, Vanessa Perry, a former mental health therapist turned intuitive counselor. Much like a physical gym, in this space we'll aim to target specific psychological muscles and train them to be stronger. I'm so glad you are joining this gym. Let's hit the weights. Hi, welcome to this episode of the Psych Gym. I have decided to stop numbering them because I don't know what order they're going to come out in. And numbering them makes me have to have them come out in that order. And I am not into that. So today what I wanted to talk to you about was, the difference between being vulnerable and trauma dumping. And I think that this is a very important conversation to have. I don't think that there's a lot of people who really talk enough about this, and it's kind of like causing more issues than helping people. So we, with the idea of vulnerability, right? Like we use that word a lot. It's a buzzword. We talk about being vulnerable as an act of bravery. We talk about it being a way to connect with one another, and those things are true. And I'm not discounting the fact that being vulnerable and open isn't going to do those things. But what we've actually seen happen a lot in and calling it vulnerability is trauma dumping. And what trauma dumping is really is just kind of like telling our story with the intent of dumping it, right? Like with the intent of having it out there. We're doing it in order to be heard. We're doing it for validation. We're doing it because it's unfair. We're fighting against the whatever it is that makes us feel like we have to say it out loud. We're not doing it with the intent of healing. And I think that is probably one of the major functions of the vulnerability that we're talking about. When we're being vulnerable, there's an intent to heal, there is an intent to connect, and that makes the very basis of why we're doing it a little bit different, right? And I'll tell you why this came up and why I wrote it down. Because I was talking, I have some clients who are on a dating journey, and that's an area of my life that continues to challenge me. But I feel like those challenges have helped me help people more, right? The better I get at things, the easier it is for me to teach people those things, right? And so in this area, I have been forced to do a lot of work. So I've been in that space. But then also, I'm in a space with a lot of men in a therapeutic environment, and I have been, over the course of my career. So there's a lot of insight that I have into not all men, but some of the psyche of men. And so the reason why I'm telling you all this is the backstory. The conversation was one of my clients who's dating, she's a female. We were talking about, or I shouldn't even say one of those clients, like we all talk about this. We talk about, trying to get to know one another and how we are supposed to do that, right? And so, we think vulnerability, right? Like we got to be vulnerable. We got to open our hearts. We got to talk about our stories. We have to let people know what's going on. We might even mention some of our traumas, maybe not on the first date, but it's going to come out, right? And so what had been happening, and I've seen this too, is that, and I feel bad because I feel like I'm picking on men. I'm not trying to pick on men because I'm sure women do this too. But for the context of these conversations, I'm just going to be honest about the conversations themselves and not, just try to equalize them. So it was more about like, hey, he opened up to me and he told me about all of his traumas and he told me this and, it felt like it was very vulnerable and we were sharing and we were connecting. But this person is like acting out, and I don't know what to do about it. And so we have these conversations about, well, what that person did wasn't being vulnerable and open with you. They were trauma dumping as a way to connect because they thought that was the right thing to do, right? And this is where I am not actually dumping on men. I am saying, like, this is an aside. In our society, we do not do a good job when it comes to men's mental health. We know this. We talk about it all the time, right? Like we're always like, oh, but like, are we really doing anything about it? Are we really, really doing anything about it? Are we really teaching men? And are they allowing it, right? Because I feel like we have this conversation about men's mental health, and how they need this and that, but then the culture remains, right? Where there's lots and lots of really terrible things being said about the people who are the men who are vulnerable and healing, right? Like it's still happening. It's so ugly. And so I think that, it's really a stretch for men to even like know their traumas, right? And understand their traumas. Because unless they've been in a space like a counseling space, they probably haven't done that work, right? Like, and so they're kind of maybe guessing a little bit, or they're only uncovering the things that were really, really obvious. And that's good. You know what I mean? Like, knowing some of your trauma is better than not knowing any of it, right? Like, and just operating from it. But they don't know what to do, right? So they want to connect, and they want you to know them. And this is the only way that they've been taught, right? Because communication of feelings, we're still so far behind when it comes to that in general, but like in the male population, really terrible at it. And most of them can't even identify them in order to communicate them effectively, right? And then after communication, there has to be work done, right? Like we have to know how to release that trauma. We have to know how to live without that being part of us. And, we just suck at that. We suck at doing that. We suck at, in our society, of like showing everybody how to identify their feelings, talk about their feelings, and move through them and do better and change your behaviors and change your belief systems that create the behaviors, right? We just aren't really good at it, right? Because a lot of times people want to change behaviors, which is great. But if you can't change your belief system, that behavior comes back, right? It does. So, that's a podcast for another day, and we will have that conversation. But we're back, to vulnerability versus trauma dumping. So that was where this came up first, in these conversations about, like, is that them connecting, or is that them, making excuses for their limitations, or for their, their actions that are coming, or that they've come. And, I think we've all been in relationships, male, female, non-binary, anything, with people who refuse to work on themselves, right? And so they can tell you very clearly what's going on, but then they're just going to act from it. And then whenever you, kind of call them out on it, they're going to say, well, my traumas, right? And it's like, okay, that's not. So what you're saying is that when we talked about this, you were just dumping that out. And now you're using it as an excuse for your behavior. And that's not what we're trying to do here, right? That's not what vulnerability really is. That's not the goal of vulnerability. And so that was in that case. But then when you think about in the online space, this happens a lot too, where people they're trauma dumping. They're calling it vulnerability. And people are identifying with them, which is connectivity. But it's not doing anything for anybody, right? So if somebody puts up, say, a TikTok about some, very traumatic event, and they're very upset about it, right? And a lot of us who are very empathetic, or we've been through that, of course, it tugs at our heartstrings. We're going to connect with that person. We're going to feel for that person, and we're going to commiserate with that person, right? Because we understand. Does that help anybody? Right? It doesn't. And so I think that's the part where we're missing the mark, right? It's okay to share our stories. I don't ever want anybody to think like, oh my God, Vanessa's just saying like we shouldn't share our stories now unless we have a solution to the problem. Like, no, not at all. Because I understand that obviously for what I do for a living, sharing your story is like part of the healing process, right? Like you got to say it out loud. You got to speak it out loud to like lessen its power. But I think when we think of the collective, when we are sharing these stories, if we think about the impact we're trying to make, and I want you all to step a little bit further, right? And say, is the impact that I'm trying to make simply for people to feel seen? That's all well and good. And you can say that, right? But if we say that, we have to be conscious of the idea that we don't want to stay there, right? And so I feel like people who are, trauma dumping or even being vulnerable, I call, I call y'all, call on y'all to just also add the caveats, right? Like add the things of like, and we are healing, or we are trying to heal, or this doesn't have power over me, or I'm not going to let this have power over me, right? Like I'm sharing so that you feel seen, but I also want us both to be seen on the other side, right? That's just one option. Um, and then for those of us that are consuming that content, it's very important for us to think about why we're consuming the content that only gives us problem, right? Problem, 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 problem. I'm living in all of my problem, right? Like I'm living in what I feel like is vulnerability, but it is actually living through trauma over and over and over again without moving into healing, right? And so we want to be careful to do that. It's good to feel like you're part of something. We are belonging people. Like as humans, we love to have belonging of some kind, but we don't want to belong to problem. We don't want to belong to trauma for very long, right? We can be there for comfort. We can be there for knowing we're not alone. We can be there for helping each other. But that's the goal, right? Like the goal is helping. The goal isn't sitting in it. The goal isn't having it, owning it, wearing it forever. And that's what happens because we recycle it, we recirculate it, and it just keeps coming around. And all we're talking about is pain. And I don't want us to only talk about pain. So when I bring this up, I don't bring it up to say, stop being vulnerable or what you feel like is vulnerable. Stop trauma dumping. I just want you to be conscious of when you're doing both and what your goal actually is and how you plan to impact people to move through it, to have hope that's not going to be their story forever. Somebody had shared something on their page the other day, and it was basically something to me that felt like it was, keeping somebody in pathology, where it was kind of like, hey, trauma literally changes your body, like, and it takes years to get out of it. And I was like, that sounds very much like giving people no hope. I was like, I feel like it was intended to make people feel like, yeah, I mean, you're going to be a little messed up, like, or a lot messed up, because trauma like does change you physiologically, but that doesn't mean that it automatically puts you years into hell, right? We've discovered that it doesn't have to mean that. It can, and it does in a lot of places because we don't have adequate access to mental health services, another podcast also, but it doesn't have to. And so, but sometimes people will see that and they'll go, oh, I knew it. And then they just continue to sit in that physiological trauma because they've accepted that that's just how it is, right? And like, could you imagine sitting in like somebody coming into my office, right? Or my online office, somebody coming in and saying, hey, here's this thing that happened. And I went, oh, well, good luck for the next 5 years. The next 5 years of your life is just going to be shit, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? That's ridiculous. I would never do that. That would make me like a really, really terrible counselor. And so I don't do that, right? Like I believe that we can shift things anytime and that the progress is not always ginormous, but we can start shifting today, right? That trauma happens yesterday. We can start shifting today. It's not going to go away today. It's not going to feel great today, but we can start that process so that you're not 5 years out in this, in this, what feels like a mess or a trauma situation, right? That by 5 years from now, you don't really remember that pain because you moved through it. You can recall the idea of it, right? And your nervous system may get involved. But when you do that healing, it doesn't run your life the same way that it will if you do not do that healing. It will run your life, right? So I definitely hope that I helped you understand a little bit of the difference between being vulnerable and trauma dumping. And also, to recognize a little bit when it's happening, when you're not the one that's doing it, right? When somebody just wants to dump their trauma on you and they're not really ever going to try to move into, solution-based thinking. it's a good idea to think about boundaries with people like that. And when I say that, I know that that's not easy. I'm still working on it myself constantly because of what I do. I give people excuses all over the place, right? Because I get it, and I will give you extra chances because I know the process. But if I give you extra chances and I do not see you trying to do anything except continuously dump on me, well, I'm going to have to charge you, right? Or put a boundary up otherwise, because that's not helpful, and it also puts me in a vibration that I don't want to live in, right? I want to live in vulnerability with people, because vulnerability with people is with purpose, right? I have opened up with purpose to connect and shift through and not let this run me. If somebody is coming to me to just simply to dump their trauma and feel validated, yeah, I'll let you do that a couple times, because I do get it. I get the process. But eventually, for my own mental health, right, I have to be able to say, I understand your traumas and I understand that. And I'm so happy that you are being open with me and that you feel like I'm safe enough to share these things with. However, it affects me so much that there isn't any change, and like, I don't know what to do with that, right? I want to help you change, but I don't want to feel like I'm just here to hear all the bad stuff only, right? And it sounds horrible, right? Like, I mean, people feel so bad putting that boundary up. They're like, oh my God, I'm a terrible friend. And the people on the other side will say, oh my God, you're a terrible friend. That's what friends are for. Like, like, friends are not, if you have a friend that is only trauma dumping on you, that is not a friend. That is a person who is looking for outside validation, and you're giving it to them. And so that's all that they're looking for. That's the end of their healing journey when it comes to this. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. I feel like, I'm still getting into my groove of what this looks like and staying on track and my little tangents. But as always, if you are looking for some assistance with any of the things that you hear on this podcast, you can reach out to me at any time. VanessaPerryCounselor@gmail.com. You can talk to me on my socials, CSEA.stars.psych on Instagram, Vanessa Perry Intuitive Counselor on Facebook. And we can connect there. If you have any suggestions for things that I should talk about, I'm always open for that too, because I want to serve in the ways that you all want me to serve, not just random things that pop into my head. Because boy, can I talk about random things that pop in my head. I'm constantly learning new things. You might not want to hear all of them. So if you have any suggestions, absolutely. If you're watching this on YouTube, just drop them below. I hope that y'all have a fantastic week, and I will see you for the next podcast. Love y'all.